5 centimeters per second, maybe even more. Now that I'm thinking about it, the distance between me and the past that I've had is way further than that. Maybe I have already walked the distance of the world in its entirety in this long journey to get here. To think about it, one of my favorite films is just under an hour, and it's directed by Makoto Shinkai, which is 5 centimeters per second. And last year in Japan, they released a live action adaptation of this film, and just a few hours ago, there is a fan screening that I attended where it was shown back to back from the 1 hour classic of 5 centimeters per second to the live action adaptation. But in between that, there is a short documentary on what Makoto Shinkai and his team was thinking of, or what they did when making 5 centimeters per second. One of the craziest thing about it is that it's really beautiful to see 5 centimeters per second in the big screen for the first time. One of my favorite moments earlier today is being able to see the dream sequences in the second short film that I really, really loved when I was young, when I was around 18 when I first saw it, and then now that I'm 26, 8 years later, it's a different life in its entirety. But to see it now as a grown man, there's still something in it that makes you feel like, connected to a certain past that you should no longer go back to. But first things first, I think 5 centimeters per second is one of, if not the best animated films that I've ever seen. And I know it's kind of like a complicated thing to talk about because a lot of people may think that it's an incomplete film, that it's just under an hour, it's just basically beautiful to look at. But for me, there's a beauty in 5 centimeters per second of it being under an hour and it being separated to three different parts. And to actually hear Makoto Shinkai after the first film was shown, there was this 15 minutes or 10-minute kind of like documentary of the making of it, to actually say the same thing, that he wished for the last short film to be much longer, to somewhat say something. But for me, I think it being an hour is worth it. And he even mentioned that the last short film is basically meant for just one song, which is One More Time, One More Chance. But for me, again, it's for me, for my understanding of it, it made it more of a poetry, which is actually mentioned by the staff. Like how much the title itself, 5 centimeters per second, is a poetry title just waiting to happen. And I loved how they discussed how only young Makoto Shinkai and only young team of his would go on with this project. Like the title in itself, the 1 hour runtime, it's really something that someone younger who's willing to take a risk would do. And I love that he mentioned that because there's something youthful about this film, like those decisions that they made, that is really youthful, that is much more realistic than you would expect. And I do understand why some people do not like the film compared to other Makoto Shinkai films because of its short runtime and overuse of beautiful animation. But for me, it's a poetry. You don't have to have a long dialogue. And the beauty of it all is that it being short is, and it having a lot of open endings, allowed you to give endings to it, or somewhat depending on where you are in your life. That's why when the One More Time, One More Chance hit in cinemas, or in cinema earlier, during that last 5 minutes of the film, I was really on the edge of my seat. It felt kind of performative, but I really want to set up a little bit and see it much closer. And that shot at the end, where the song is hitting its crescendo before it abruptly ends, or whatever, just watching Taki waiting for the train to stop. It's one of the most beautiful animated. It's one of my favorite endings of all time, and I really love that ending. And so, for me personally, that film as an hour is perfect. I wouldn't add anything to it. I wouldn't subtract anything to it. The ambiguity in some of the parts in the film or in the story of not being able to give out these letters is really poetic for me. So when that was done, we had the short film, and then finally got to see the live action adaptation, which is I was surprised to actually I was surprised because I loved it too. But to get it out of the way, the first film is an hour, the live action is 2 hours. So you know already that there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that's new, that is not part of the film. I have managed to read like the manga version of the anime, so I have an idea of where they would go, but I didn't expect that they would actually make the film more connected in terms of the characters. One of the characters in the story of 5 centimeters per second that wasn't really fully developed is the daughter, sorry, the sister of one of the characters in the second short film. They made that teacher connected also to, to Wakari, so it's kind of like poetic how they're saying that sometimes you don't get to meet people, but somehow there's something that connects you no matter what happens. So I also love the fact that they developed also a side character in the last short film in the animated film, wherein the older version of Taki or Tono is that this girl who is now much older, and like how did they meet? Like they have this beautiful line like, we have texted each other for 1,000 times but we only got a centimeter closer. It's a beautiful way of saying things, that this guy Takagi is really distant. um and I just really loved how that one went. So I think it's Risa, the name of the character. Am I correct? Is that Risa? Yep, it's Risa. So I just had to double check on that one. So with the way that the film was going, I couldn't help myself but be like, I wonder where it will lead, what they will change. And so one of the key things that I really loved is the cinematography of this film. And I know like, oh, cinematography, but they maximize that to really achieve this feeling. I have watched a lot of old Japanese classics thanks to the Japanese Film Festival, that I know what kind of technique they're doing. And I actually miss this kind of way of. I'm glad that they haven't had the sickness of Filipino films and Hollywood with the overuse of cinematic in a way that it doesn't help the story. But in here, the use of that is really helpful. And one of the things, or the key things that I would like to say out loud, one of my favorite parts, or my all-time favorite part in the animation, is the dream sequences, like I mentioned earlier. They took that out in this film, which I understand because of how it ended. I realize why it's not really important to put that. But what they did, especially with Kanai, with Sumida, that's the easiest way to, in the second short film, they use Sumida here in a way to really give this aesthetic and cinematic like vibe, like indie vibe of, instead of having those dream sequences, there's a difference in terms of the cinematography with Sumida's arc. And what I loved about this film is, of course, it has a different style of direction, editing. And so if the animation is divided into three parts, the live action adaptation gives us a way to go back to those memories, not being forced to like, oh, stop, pause. No, it is indeed like more about reminiscing, like flashbacks, but the flashbacks were done beautifully and in separate manners, or in a separate manner, instead of being divided. There's a difference between that. Like, it's in a separate manner in terms, like, for example, the first short film in the animated film, they took parts of it, divided it, and put it within the film. That's why when some of the parts of the first short film was put in the end, it made the ending much better and speak much louder. I think that's one of the best changes that they did, putting the beginning to the end, if that makes sense. So in its 2 hour runtime, 80% of the animate version, or the animation, the dialogue of it, the images of it were adapted. And so I have no problem with that. But what I really loved is how they made this ending, and how they actually made it reminiscent for me of 18 by 2 Beyond Youthful Days. I don't want to spoil that one, but basically in that story, he decided to go to where his youthful love interest lives. So wants to revisit that now that he's older. So Takaki had that kind of arc in this film, which was not part of the animation, and I loved that part. And that's where the one more time, one more chance hit, and I was like, I really love that because they used the song beautifully, perfectly, shot for shot of that sequence was parallel to how they did it with the beginning. And so I was like, is there going to be something different here? I was expecting the ending based on the animation, but then when the film happened, I'm like, oh, they're doing something different. But then it continued, and I was like, they should have ended it there. It's still ambiguous. I like the ambiguity of the animation, but why did they still continue? And so they still continued and had this beautiful story that continued it, that these characters somehow, in some way, were in the same room but never got to meet again. And so one of my favorite parts of it is that they had these conversations about it. Not, I don't want to spoil it because it's really something that you have to see. What I love about it is that Takaki in this film finally gets to address something that you think of when you watch the ending of the animation. And to see that as a grown man, I see myself like, I'm glad he had that, cathartic feeling of release that he doesn't have to carry it anymore, and how it played a huge role for me to just almost, it's kind of weird saying it. I was almost teary eyed when I watched that because I wish I could have done that. This is my way of doing it. I wish I could have said something like, I wish I could have had one more chance or one more time. But then realizing you don't have to have it, you have to stop chasing that. Because if you keep chasing this one more time, one more chance, will you ever truly have a chance? And that was beautiful. And then it continued and it gave the same ending. And I'm not sad about it because the difference between the film and the animation is that the animation is poetic, the live action adaptation is realistic, cathartic. And that made me think that that's what I needed. Because why do I have to watch a live action adaptation if it's going to be the carbon copy of the animation, right? So the changes in here are intricate, and I'm glad that they didn't go a different, like a certain route in the film of just giving Takaki a way too happy ending. I'm glad they just gave him enough of an ending where he could truly begin again. And that's, I think, is the lovely message of 5 centimeters per second, because it's really about, understanding that it's not too late for you. I really love the idea of mentioning age and more like trivias and kind of stuff, like the idea that it will take you 30 years to somewhat, that basically if you're already 30 years old, the amount of steps you've taken, that's basically the amount of steps you need to circle around the world, but it's only the time that you actually get to truly live and somewhat do it all together, that it takes you that long to realize that this is your life and that's how you live. It's a good message, and it's a great message, I think, that it's never too late to start over and do right by you and those that you've hurt or those you have shared a life with. So yeah, I don't think it's as perfect for me as the animation, but all the changes in here and the actors in here are tremendous. And it's no way a perfect film, but I'll do. It was a perfect thing to watch it back to back. So I recommend seeing the first animation and then this one, just to have, you know a processing of things. It's a 4 out of 5 for me. I really enjoyed it. Peace.